I'm employed as an associate medical examiner at the medical examiner's office here in Orlando.
What do you do on a day-to-day basis as an associate medical examiner?
So as a medical examiner, our basic goal is to determine cause of death and manner of death in certain individuals that die within our counties or within our jurisdiction. So cause of death and manner of death are a little bit different. A cause of death is a disease or an injury that ultimately leads to someone's death. The manner of death is a little bit different. That's kind of a way to categorize or group deaths based on the circumstances. And so for that, we only have 5 choices. So that would be natural, accident, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. So again, our goal is to determine those 2, the cause and manner of death.
Can you describe for the jury your educational background and training that allows you to do that?
Sure. So I have a bachelor's degree in kinesiology from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I then went to medical school in Kansas City, Missouri. After that, I did a 1-year clinical rotating internship at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. And then I went back to Wisconsin to do my residency, and that was in anatomic and clinical pathology. And then I have 2 fellowships. One is in cytopathology. That was from Northwestern University in Chicago. And then I did a fellowship in forensic pathology in Tampa.
Are you licensed to practice medicine in the state of Florida?
Yes, I am.
All right. Does your work as an associate medical examiner involve the performance of autopsies?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury generally what an autopsy is and what it entails?
So an autopsy is also called a post-mortem or after-death examination. It involves what's called an external examination, which is kind of how that sounds, observing somebody's characteristics, what they look like, hair color, eye color, weight, anything that would be specific to that individual, if they have a tattoo or a surgical scar, something like that. And we're also looking for any signs of injury or disease externally. After the external examination is the internal examination. And so that means that we open up the body cavities and we remove the organs and we observe them and dissect them. And again, while we're doing that, we're looking for any signs of disease or injury. And we can also add on additional tests. So we can do things like toxicology, we can look at some of the other laboratory results, and then using all that information, external examination, the internal examination, and any other tests that we do to help come to that cause of death and that manner of death.
Can you estimate about how many autopsies you've performed in your career?
It varies from year to year, but usually it's around 220 to 250, give or take. So at this point in time, I'm well over 1,500 autopsies.
What does the term pathology mean?
The basic definition, it just means it's the study of disease.
What is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is a subset of pathology, so it's a subspecialization where we focus on injuries and wounds in a medical legal way. So what that means is when I say we investigate deaths that fall under our jurisdiction, and that's because we operate under a Florida statute or a Florida law that tells us exactly which types of deaths fall under our jurisdiction. And then by law, we are required to investigate those deaths as we do.
Are you considered a forensic pathologist?
Yes.
Did you perform an autopsy on Sade Dixon?
Yes, I did.
Would she have been brought from the scene to the medical examiner's office by the medical examiner's investigators?
We have investigators that work at our office, and they will go to a scene if there is a scene, and they will take pictures, they'll gather information, and they coordinate the transportation. So they don't actually transport the body themselves. What they do is they ensure that the body is properly prepared in a shroud, which is sealed, and then we have a third party who transports the body from the scene to our office, and then we ensure that that shroud has not been disturbed at all. So we need to make sure that it's still sealed properly so that nothing happened from the scene to the time that the body comes to our office. But we use a third party to do the actual transport.
Was there a unique medical examiner case number assigned to the autopsy of Sade Dixon?
Yes.
And what was that number?
It's number, we start with the year that that we're in. And so in this case, this was ME 2016, -1865.
And when Ms. Dixon's body was brought to the medical examiner's office, was there any kind of tag or notification or identification on her body to designate who that was?
Yes, so at the scene, the investigators will put plastic bracelets around the wrist, both wrists, with the number. And if we know the name of the decedent at the time, that name will also be on the bracelet.
And was Ms. Dixon's name on the bracelet?
Yes.
May I approach?
You may.
Showing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit Q for identification. Do you recognize the person in that photograph?
Yes.
How do you recognize?
That's Sade Dixon from, this was our initial autopsy photo, one of our initials.
And is this the individual you performed the autopsy on?
Yeah.
Dixon?
Yes.
This time, State, is this a fair and accurate depiction of what she looked like when you performed the autopsy?
Yes.
This time, State would move Q into evidence as next in line, Your Honor.
Any other objections? I'm sorry?
Objection.
All right. Over the defense's objection, this will be admitted as State's Exhibit number 25.
May I publish?
Yes, sir.
And is this the photograph that we just looked at?
Yes.
When was the autopsy on Ms. Dixon performed?
It was performed on December 14th of 2016 at 9:05 in the morning.
And how old was she represented to be?
24 years.
How tall was she?
I'm going to just reference my report here for a second. She was measured at 69 inches in length and with a weight of 165 pounds.
What was she wearing when she arrived at the autopsy?
She was wearing a short sleeve shirt and gray shorts, as well as some patterned kind of leggings, and then black Ugg boots.
During the course of your autopsy, is it normal to take photographs of injuries that you've noticed on a person's body?
Yes, that's standard, is to take pictures of injuries that we see.
Did you do so in this case?
Yes.
May I approach again?
Yes, sir.
Showing you State's Exhibit R for identification. Could you look through those and tell me if you recognize what those show?
So these are some of the injuries that we documented at the time of the autopsy.
Do those fairly and accurately depict the injuries that you documented during the autopsy?
Yes.
This time, State would move States R into evidence, as I believe 26, Your Honor.
Objection.
Are these 14?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. This will be admitted over objection as State's Exhibit number 26, consisting of 14 photographs, composite exhibit.
Did you examine her fingernails?
Yes.
Describe them to the jury.
She had either, I'm not sure if they were acrylic or gel fingernails, but they were long, well kept, and we take clippings of fingernails at the time of the exam as well.
Were any of the fingernails broken off, chipped, damaged in any way?
Not that I recall.
Did you notice evidence of medical treatment on her body when she arrived at the autopsy?
I don't believe she had any. She just had some electrocardiogram leads on her torso.
Did you notice any obvious injuries to her body when you began the autopsy?
Yes.
Generally, what were those? I won't go into the details, but generally.
Sure. I saw multiple circular and oval-shaped defects, which externally initially looked consistent with gunshot wounds, and also some minor abrasions on her face.
Using the photographs, I'm going to ask you to walk the jury through the various gunshot wounds that you noticed.
Sure.
Did you label the different gunshot wounds somehow in your report?
Yes, so if there are multiple gunshot wounds, I usually use a lettering system just to keep track of the different injuries.
And just so the jury's not misled in any way, does the order A, B, C, D reflect any opinion as far as what order the gunshots were inflicted upon Ms. Dixon's body?
No, I can't tell which order they happened. It's just a way, again, to keep track of the different injuries.
Referring to gunshot wound A, showing you photograph 1 from States 26. Please describe where that first gunshot wound A was located.
Sure, so this is in the outside part of the right arm, so a little bit above the elbow.
Okay. Did you see any kind of muzzle imprint on the wound or anything like that?
No.
What would you look for what would indicate that there was a muzzle imprint?
So a muzzle imprint happens when the end of the gun is in contact with the skin. And if it's pressed against the skin and the gun is discharged, we oftentimes will see an abrasion that looks like a mirror image of the muzzle of the gun. It's an abrasion, and sometimes it's called a muzzle imprint or a muzzle stamp. And so that just tells us that the end of the gun is in contact with the skin. So I did not see that in this wound, so that means that the end of the gun was not touching the skin.
Did you locate any soot around the wound?
No.
What does that tell you?
Again, it tells me that this is not a close or contact wound, so it can be deposited around the wound edges if the end of the gun is close or touching the skin.
Did you notice any stippling around the wound?
No.
What is stippling?
So stippling, when a gun is discharged, one of the things that comes out of that is little specks of gunpowder. Some of it is burned, some of it is unburned. But if it's close enough to the skin, those little particles will impact the skin, and they make a very small abrasion. And so we call that stippling. And it kind of looks like light freckles. They're usually kind of red to tan, very small, and they'll be scattered around the wound. And that tells us that the end of the gun is not touching the skin, and it's a little bit farther away, just giving us an idea of the range or how far away that gun may have been. And in this wound, there was no stippling.
You mentioned that what we see in photograph 1 of stage 26, is an entrance wound.
Correct.
How do you know that?
So wounds have different characteristics, and typically, as in this case, the wound it's oval shaped, but it's very well defined. And if you tried to put the edges of the wound together, you wouldn't be able to, as in this case. It's a very punched out lesion. So, and also surrounding the wound is what's called a margin of abrasion, where it almost looks like the skin is making a little ridge, or it's kind of piled up. So those are different characteristics that help us figure out whether it's an entrance or an exit gunshot wound.
Did you locate an exit wound associated with this entrance wound?
Yes.
Showing you photograph 2 of stage 26. What do we see here?
So that's the exit wound corresponding.
And how can you tell it's an exit wound?
So this exit wounds can be a little bit variable, and they're not always typical. And so in this one, you see that it's not a perfect circle, it's not a perfect oval, and some of the edges are a little bit irregular and jagged. And this one, the edges can be pushed together a little bit easier.
Can you describe for the jury the path of travel that the projectile took as it entered her arm and exited?
So it really just involved the skin and then some of the tissue that's underneath the skin. So it didn't involve the bone or any vital structures. It was a fairly simple in and out.
And what was the direction of travel?
This went from the right to the left and downward.
And how do you determine that from a normal anatomical position?
Right. So it can be difficult with wound paths because you can imagine all the different ways and the different position the body can be in. So when we describe the wound paths, we always refer to what's called a standard anatomic position. And that would be the person standing straight up with the arms at the side and the palms facing forward. And again, that's so that all the wound paths can be consistent in how we're describing them. That doesn't mean that's the position the individual was in at the time. It's the way that we describe it is in that position.
So unlike on TV, you often can't tell the position of the victim at the time the wound was inflicted. Right?
Very rarely, very rarely.
And obviously, since this was an entrance and an exit wound, did you recover any projectile in her arm?
No.
Referring to gunshot wound B, I'm showing you photograph 3 from stage 26. Describe for the jury where gunshot wound B was located.
Again, this is on the right arm, kind of on the posterior or the back part of the arm, and you can see her elbow in that picture. So it's very near the elbow.
Did you locate any soot or stippling near the entrance wound?
No.
Was there, was there an exit wound associated with gunshot wound B?
There was not.
Can you describe the direction of travel that projectile took as it entered her body?
It basically went from back to front. It didn't travel a very far distance. So,
Were you able to recover a projectile from this wound?
Yes.
And explain to the jury how you did that.
So I knew there was a projectile ahead of time. Before we do the autopsy, we do x-rays. And when we suspect there are gunshot wounds, we do that ahead of time so that we know if there's a projectile so that we can retrieve it. So I knew the general location from the x-ray. I could see where the entrance wound was. And when you retrieve the bullet projectile, the most important thing is to not use too many cutting tools because I don't want to leave any marks on that projectile. So I can usually feel where it is. I make a small incision next to it, and then I just gently kind of work the projectile out.
And why don't you want to use cutting tools to mark the projectile up?
Well, there can be some characteristics on a projectile that may help identify, that can be matched more or less to a firearm that fired that projectile. I don't do that part. I just collect the projectile.
Can I approach? Showing you states S as in Sam for identification. Can you take a look at that? Tell me if you, can you open it up, look inside, tell me if you recognize the contents. Get you some scissors.
Oh.
Thank you.
All right, so this is the container that I placed the projectile in, and it looks like it has been moved to a different envelope. So,
Has it been sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement based on the markings of the package for analysis?
correct.
Okay. Is it, if you will need to open up the envelope and take a look inside, can you do that?
Okay, yes, it's in here.
Okay. Is it in the same or substantially the same condition as when you removed it from the arm of Ms. Dixon during the autopsy?
Yes.
This time, State would move S into evidence as 27, Your Honor.
No objection.
All right, this will be received without objection as State's Exhibit number 27.
Showing you photograph 4 of State's 26. What do we see here?
So that's a picture of that projectile after I removed it at the time of the autopsy.
Photograph 5
Same projectile, just from a different angle.
and photograph 6.
Sure, and so that's the bottom portion of that projectile.
Okay. Referring to gunshot wound C, showing you photograph 7 of State's 26. Can you explain what we're looking at here?
Sure, so you can see actually two defects. So one is an entrance gunshot wound, and the second is an exit.
Those defects located by the armband, the orange armband?
Correct.
Did you locate any kind of soot or stippling on this wound?
No.
Which is the entrance and which is the exit?
The entrance is the one that is closer to that band.
Can you describe the path the projectile took and the damage it did to her body?
Sure, so this went through the skin and it went through the muscles. And this one actually did involve both bones of the forearm. One is called the radius and one is called the ulna. And so it caused fractures of both of those bones. And then it exited. And that exit wound is the one that's a little bit farther away from the wristband.
And I'm assuming no projectile was recovered from this wound, correct?
No projectile.
Referring you to gunshot wound D and E together, can you describe what we're looking at in photograph 8 of State's 26?
Sure, so there are two gunshot wounds. Both of these are entrance gunshot wounds.
Did you locate any soot or stippling in the entrance wounds that we see here?
No.
Showing you photograph 3 again of State's 26. Do we see the exit wounds in this photograph?
Yes, so there are two defects. What you're looking at is the side of the torso or the side of the body here.
Can you describe the path of travel that each of these gunshot wounds took?
They were similar in their paths in that they went from the left side of the body to the right side of the body, from the front toward the back, and also in a downward direction.
Or either projectile that caused these wounds recovered?
No.
Referring to gunshot wound F, showing you photograph 9 of States 26, what do we see here?
So you can see an entrance gunshot wound, and it's in the middle of that tattoo, so where that red flower is. So that's an entrance gunshot wound.
Did you locate any soot or stippling around the entrance wound?
No.
What does this photograph show, photograph 10?
I believe that's one of the exit wounds.
Okay. And can you describe for the jury the path of travel that projectile took through her body?
That went from the back to the front, and also from the left to the right, and a little bit in an upward direction.
Did you recover any projectile from this wound?
No.
Referring to gunshot wound G, we're showing you photograph 11 from States 26. What do we see here?
So you're looking at the inside part of her right foot, and there's an entrance gunshot wound in the heel.
And that wound looks a little black. Can you just explain why?
So, as I mentioned, she was wearing black boots, and so the projectile went through the boot before it went through her foot, and so some of the material, the insulating material, came with the projectile and was deposited into the wound that you see there.
And you actually examined the boot to see the defect in the boot as well?
Yes, and when we have, if we think that a projectile went through a clothing item like a shoe or a boot, we not only take pictures, but we also x-ray that to make sure that there's no projectile left inside of that item.
Showing you photograph 12 of States 26. Did you locate an exit wound from that wound in her foot?
Right, so that's the exit wound corresponding.
What was the direction of travel of this projectile?
That was from the left to the right.
And I'm assuming no projectile was recovered.
No projectile.
Referring to gunshot wound H, showing you photograph 13 of States 26. Can you describe for the jury where gunshot wound H is, the entrance?
So that's an entrance wound on the back of the left thigh.
Any soot or stippling in that area?
No.
Can you describe the path of travel that projectile took?
That went from the back to the front and upwards.
Showing you photograph 14 of States 26. Did you locate an exit wound?
Yes.
Describe what we see here.
So you kind of see two areas. One that's kind of in the what's called the inguinal fold, or where the underwear would lie. So that's the exit wound. And then a little bit above, kind of near where the tattoo is, you can kind of see an irregular wound with some kind of red-brown abrasion. So the wound itself, the exit wound, is the one that lies in the inguinal fold. Oh, I'm sorry, inguinal.
Spell that.
Sure. INGUIAL. And then the other area with the abrasion that looks a little bit irregular, most likely what happened is that she may have had her leg flexed up so that part of that area was folded over and was in close contact to where the projectile was exiting. So we do see that sometimes. Again, if the body is positioned in different ways, you can have wounds associated with the exit wound.
Is that consistent with her being on maybe her hands and knees? You said it was...
It could be. It could be, or if somebody is standing, and if you think about you bend your knee up and you bring it close to your body, it could be that position as well. So any way in which the top part of the leg is flexed towards the body could have caused that wound.
And the direction of travel you said was upward?
Correct.
Did you recover a projectile from this wound?
No.
So of all the wounds, you recovered just the one projectile from her arm, right?
Yes.
Based on the appearance of the gunshot wounds, were they all inflicted at or about the same time?
Yes.
Based on the injuries, what is the likelihood that Ms. Dixon would have been mobile after being shot this many times?
Well, mobile, not for very long, and the reason I say that is because when we saw the pictures of the gunshot wound of the torso, one of those went directly through her heart. And so we know that she would most likely be able to move a little bit, or be mobile, or be conscious for a very short period of time. But the problem is blood loss. And so with the heart being damaged, with it being perforated by the gunshot wound, the blood loss is very rapid, which means that she would not be mobile for a very long period of time, and most likely not be conscious for a very long period of time.
Did you also do an internal examination of Ms. Dixon's body?
Yes.
Did you locate any signs of disease or anything like that that could have contributed to cause her death?
No, not natural disease, no.
During your autopsy, were you able to determine whether Ms. Dixon was pregnant?
Yes, she was pregnant at the time of her death.
And how did you determine that?
Visually, I found a fetus within the uterus, as well as doing chemical test or blood test.
Regarding the visual examination, were you able to determine the length of the fetus?
Yes, so we can do a couple of measurements to help determine the age, and we do what's called a measurement from the top of the head to what's called the rump, or beneath the buttocks, and you can also measure from the top of the head to the feet.
Were you able to notice whether or not the fetus was male or female?
It appeared to be a male fetus.
And how long was the crown to rump length?
I measured at 8.2 centimeters.
Using that measurement, what does that mean as far as the stage of development of the fetus?
Sure, so that would correspond to around 12 to 13 weeks gestational age.
You mentioned you also did some kind of laboratory analysis.
Yes.
Explain what you did to the jury.
Sure, so I did a blood test called HCG, or that's called human chorionic gonadotropin. It's a hormone that's released by some of the cells that are in the placenta that's associated with the fetus. It's the same chemical that's used to detect a pregnancy, but when we look at the levels, you can also it will also give us an idea if the pregnancy has ended. So when I mean the pregnancy has ended, that could either be from a childbirth or miscarriage, or in this case, maternal demise or death of the mother. Those levels will fall almost immediately.
So if those levels fall almost immediately and your autopsy was done, I believe, the following day?
Yes.
Were the levels that you noticed in the lab results consistent with the crown to rump length of the unborn child?
Right. So consistent for the fact that I know that there was maternal demise, meaning that the value that I received from the lab was lower than what you would expect for a 12 to 13 week gestational age fetus. However, knowing that the mother had died more than 12 hours before, that corresponds to the fetal death as well as the maternal death.
Did the gunshot wounds inflicted upon Ms. Dixon also result in the death of the unborn child?
Yes.
Based on your autopsy, did you determine what the cause of death was regarding Ms. Dixon?
Yes, the cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds.
Did you determine what the manner of death was?
Yes.
What was it?
Homicide.
Thank you, doctor. No further questions for me.
Cross.
Yes. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
So, how many projectiles would we expect to find, since you only found one, based on the number of wounds that you saw total?
Right. Well, all I know is that I have 8 separate gunshot wounds and 1 projectile that I recovered.
Right. So 7 projectiles is what we should find, correct?
I don't know if the gun was discharged more than that or not. All I know is the wounds that I found on this decedent.
So at least 7.
Yes.
I mean, putting aside your knowledge of the crime scene, which is really nothing, based on your work that you did, there should be 7 projectiles out there that correspond to the 7 wounds where you didn't find the bullet inside her, correct?
Yes.
All right. And so you can't say whether those wounds were caused by a direct hit, meaning the gun being fired and hitting her, or whether they were a ricochet of a bullet off of something that then went to her. Is that correct?
Some of the wounds, looked very characteristic. If a projectile hits another object before it hits a person, oftentimes the wounds will look atypical or not usual for an entrance gunshot wound. So many of these looked pretty typical. Some of them did look a little atypical, so it's possible.
Okay, so the ones that looked atypical are wounds that could have been caused by a ricochet off of something.
It's possible.
Okay. And you can't say with any certainty which shot was first and which shot was last.
Correct.
And you can't say that the shot that would have hit the heart was the first, second, third, or last.
Correct.
And in terms of, I think you testified to this, but in terms of the location and position of the body at the time that the shooting occurred, you can't say with any certainty what position she was in.
Correct.
She could have been standing up, laying down, you don't know.
Right.
Now, you indicated that the fetus was approximately 12 to 13 weeks, correct?
Yes.
And there would have been a process where you evaluated the organs of the fetus if it was considered a viable age. Is that correct?
Yeah, we consider viability around 21 to 22 weeks.
Okay. Those are all the questions. Thank you, ma'am.
Redirect.
Viable means that the fetus can live outside of the mother's body, correct?
Correct.
And at this point, the child's life was dependent on...
Objection leading.
Sustained.
At this point, was the child's life dependent on the mother?
Correct.
Thank you, Doctor.
May this witness be excused? State.
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense.
Yes.
Thank you, doctor. You are free to go.
Thank you.
State. Oops, sorry. Yes, of course.
Oh, sorry.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, the state has rested their case. I need to have a legal discussion with the attorneys, so I'm going to send you back to the jury room. We'll bring you back just as soon as we can. So you good or you need a break? You good? You're good? Okay. All right. Mr. Lyman, you have a motion? Mr. Schwartz, you have a motion?
Morning, Judge.
Good Good morning, how are you?
Good, thanks.
You know that swivels.
Pardon me?
That podium swivels.
It's all right, Judge, and I won't move it too much. Judge, we will renew all our motions and objections. Also, we'll move for judgment of acquittal on all counts. The state's failed to make a prima facie case proving all the elements on counts 1 through 5, Judge. That's including on count 1, they failed to prove the premeditation necessary for the first-degree murder, Judge. They failed to show an intent to kill prior to the shooting. They failed to show the defendant had any preconceived plan, any evidence of there was a special arrangement to obtain a weapon before going to the scene. They failed to present any evidence showing that the defendant had time for reflection prior to the shooting. There was no anticipation of a killing. They failed to prove that he had a fully formed conscious purpose to kill. The evidence here is equally consistent with the heat of passion killing, Judge. And by the way, this is for counts 1 and 2 together. They've failed to show that the defendant had any fully formed conscious purpose to commit a murder, which existed for a sufficient amount of time prior to the offense in order to allow for sufficient reflection under the law, Judge. Here, they simply haven't shown that there's anything that is inconsistent with the heat of passion killing. They haven't shown the sufficient intent to actually commit a murder, Judge, in order to sustain the first-degree murder conviction that they're going for. It requires here a fully formed and conscious purpose to actually take the life of another human being, which is formed with reflection and deliberation, both at the time and before and during the homicide. All of this hasn't been proven regarding counts 1 and 2, Your Honor. And on count 3, you also have the same...
Hold on, Mr. Schwartz. I'm going to do this counts at a time so the record is clear. State, you wish to respond on counts 1 and 2?
Not only that, at this stage, all of the evidence, reasonable inferences taken in light most favorable to the state, testimony of Ronald Stewart, as they were leaving to go inside the house, the defendant said no, she's not going to happen, she's not going. They removed the gun from his pocket, they worked the slide, loaded the round, began firing, advanced on him, stood over him, and fired. And there's sufficient evidence that we could determine premeditation in this case, and he denied it.
All right, thank you. You get the last word on 1 and 2 if you want it.
Sure, Judge. I would just point out that this happened quickly, and there really was no point in which the defendant could have formed the fully formed, necessary, and conscious purpose to actually commit the offense, Judge. He doesn't have the opportunity for reflection or deliberation. That's why you don't have the premeditation necessary for the first-degree murder on counts 1 and 2.
All right, as to counts 1 and 2, Mr. Stewart's testimony was that the defendant racked the gun. He didn't describe it as racking, but the motion he made is exactly that, which means he loaded a bullet into the chamber when, according to Mr. Stewart, both he and Ms. Dixon were attempting to remove themselves from the scene. That would be sufficient for a jury to determine that there was premeditation. The state has established a prima facie case as to both of those counts. Of course, the second count, this is just for the record, being tied to the mother's death because it's the child. So you may proceed. The JOA on 1 and 2 are denied. Go ahead.
And then on 3, Judge, the same argument regarding the premeditation and the design to kill, but also adding that he didn't commit an act with the intention to cause the death of Mr. Stewart. So for count 3, the state's failed to make a prima facie case proving all of their elements.
State, you wish to respond to count 3.
As to the premeditation, Your Honor, it would be the same as before. As to the act intending to cause death, Stewart's testimony was that he was laying on his back and the defendant stood over him and shot him in the chest. I think that's sufficient act to show that he intended to cause death.
You get the last word if you want it on that one, Mr. Schwartz.
No, Judge, nothing further.
All right, on that one, the court does find the state has established a prima facie case. Mr. Stewart additionally said that it was his impression that the defendant was aiming for his heart, which would be enough to establish premeditation. So as to count 3, state has met their burden. The motion for judgment of acquittal is denied. Next.
Then for the remaining counts, the attempted felony murders, Judge, the state hasn't proved that Mr. Loyd committed or attempted to commit the underlying felony of a murder. They also haven't proved that he committed any intentional act that isn't the essential element of the murder itself. There is evidence that's been presented of a discharge of a firearm, but that itself is an essential element of the underlying felony, which is the accusation of murder. So the discharge of the firearm itself isn't sufficient to create that essential element that isn't of the underlying felony. Therefore, they haven't met their burden for counts 4 and 5.
Mr. Ridgway,
The underlying act is the final two shots, which according to both Dixon Daniels and her son, the defendant fired at the door after they opened the door and peered at it. That's an independent act from the murders that constitutes the felony.
Mr. Ridgway, I have a transcript of the testimony of both Ms. Dixon Daniels and Mr. Stewart. They did say there were 2 shots fired after they slammed the door. And I just got it this morning and I'm glancing through it. But I don't see where either one of them said that he fired at the door. It may be that I'm missing it in the transcripts. I just got it this morning as I was taking the bench, and I was trying to listen to testimony, so I haven't really.
I would point out, Your Honor, the fact that the physical evidence, first of all, the 2 shell casings in the roadway were both.
There's no doubt he fired 2 shots in the road. Yeah. I'm good with that, yeah.
There is a bullet strike on the door itself. There is the bullet strike on the pillar, which the dowel rod was inserted, both of which are consistent with having come from the direction where it was. At least circumstantially, there's sufficient evidence that the timing of those shots are sufficient to establish that he was shooting him. And I would also point out our testimony of both of those witnesses, of Dominic Daniels and Dixon Daniels, was that the other 2 victims were laying on the sidewalk at that time, on the porch, so they were obviously down. That's just circumstances that are sufficient that shooting at the door is the only reasonable interpretation of the case.
Did any witness testify? Because the only 2 transcripts I ordered, and these are rough, I think, were Ms. Dominique Dixon and Stephanie Daniels Dixon. Did any witness testify as to when the shot hit the door, or you're just assuming, or are you just basing this circumstantially?
Circumstantially.
Okay.
No one testified to exactly which shot
Hit the door? Okay.
I will point out the testimony of the medical examiner. There were 8 shots fired into Ms. Dixon's body.
Right.
And so these strikes on the column and the door, and additionally there's a shot fired into Mr. Stewart as he lay on the ground, counts for 8 of the shots. And there's a total of 11.
Okay.
So circumstantially, those 2 shots, 4 in the column, would be separate and apart from those 8, at least 8 rounds that we know of right
So I have 8 rounds that were fired into Ms. Dixon. How many were fired into Mr. Stewart? Remind me.
Stewart testified
2.
2, 1 in his leg,
One
in
there.
his chest.
So that's 10.
Yes.
And there was a total of 11?
11 casings recovered.
11 casings recovered. Okay. Mr. Schwartz, you get the last word if you want.
Judge, my understanding is that the victims actually just heard the final gunshots, but there isn't any separation here that would distinguish the gunshots relating to the underlying felony from the ones on these 2 counts, Judge. There's a Supreme Court case from Florida. It's Milton v. State, 161.
Do you have a copy of it?
Pardon me?
Do you have a copy of it?
No,
for
Judge,
everyone?
we had a little printer issue last night.
Okay.
I'll give you the citation.
So what's the site?
161 Southern 3rd, 1245. It's a 2014 case, Judge. And so in this instance, the discharge of the firearm, as I mentioned, that's the underlying felony. You don't have any distinction between,
What's the name of that case?
it's Milton, Milton v. State.
Yeah, I've read Milton. I don't think Milton, go ahead. Yeah.
As I was saying, the discharge itself is the underlying felony. You can't make the distinction between the shots. There isn't evidence that's able to separate one from the other. So all you have is his act and the conduct that supports, according to the state, the underlying felony. They just haven't presented or explained how you can distinguish between the two.
I don't think Milton's controlling, because if I recall Milton correctly, I have it somewhere, it's probably in that notebook. Milton is the one where the attempted felony murder was also charged as it was attempted second-degree murder, attempted felony murder, same victims, same shots. This is different.
He was firing into a crowd in Milton.
Right, but
So
they
you
were the
did- you had
same.
multiple potential victims there, Judge.
Okay. But there was a problem with Milton that doesn't exist in this one. Let me find it real quickly. I've read Milton. I don't think Milton is the controlling case, but I'm willing to reread it. I'm sorry, go ahead. I interrupted your argument. Go ahead.
No, that's all, Judge. You just, as I was mentioning, you don't have the separation that's necessary to distinguish one from the other.
I don't believe that's your strongest argument, because what you're hearing is the shooting had stopped when Mr. Dixon and Ms. Dixon Daniels opened the door. Mr. Dixon, Dominique Dixon's testimony was that he saw Mr. Loyd raising his hand. He didn't say what he saw in the hand, as I recall. He slammed the door shut. And then they heard 2 gunshots, which were separate from the gunshots they all heard originally, which were the ones that resulted in the death of Ms. Dixon and Mr. Stewart being shot. So any other argument you want to put on the record?
No,
on that
Judge.
one? I'm sorry?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Let me read, I'm just going to reserve for a short period of time on these 2. I just need to finish reading these transcripts. So state you're relying on the circumstances of separate gunshots, the strike in the door, the strike in the column.
Well, as the court pointed out, there was a circumstance of the fact that the shooting was stopped. When the door opened and the 2 family members were in the door, they saw this defendant raising his hand, not a big stretch to assume that the gun in his hand. They then slammed the door, and then the shot was fired. The shot was in reaction to him opening the door, combined with all the other circumstances. Satisfy the burden at this point.
Okay. Let me just, I'd like to go ahead and rule on all of this right now. So give me 1 second to finish reading Mr. Daniels' testimony. Sure, go ahead. Why don't you guys take a 10-minute break while I read through all this?